Today, I'm going to talk about how to grow a 10x team with code reviews or best practices for creating and reviewing pull requests. Um, so first, I'd like to say a disclaimer for anyone watching this video who doesn't work at Analytics. We write software for medical devices, and we tend to have smaller teams, so some of our best practices may not apply to your situation. But this talk's loosely divided into two halves. The first half, I'll be talking at a higher theoretical level. And then in the second half, I'll get into the practice of doing pull requests, and I'll kind of step through the whole process at pretty granular level, going, step by step with just my thoughts and best practices as we go. Um, so diving in, I'd like to start by placing code review within the software development lifecycle. This diagram shows an idealized lifecycle for a new feature divided into discrete stages. Time progresses from left to right. And I guess I'll go through a little bit about what I envision goes into each stage, because I suspect I don't always consciously divide it up into stages, but I think there's some utility in doing this in the context of code review. So when I talk about the requirement stage, this kind of begins when you create the issue or user story. It involves asking the product owner questions, maybe during a sprint planning meeting or an email. I would put creating user interface mockups, which our engineers on our team tend to do. I would put that in the requirement stage. And then also, if we're on a regulated project, then documenting all of this, say in the SRS, that would all go on this stage. So I think we requirements is a critical stage, since no matter how talented we are, if we build the wrong thing, it doesn't do any good, right? So that's requirements. So now the design stage. So the larger a feature is, the more design, in more explicit design work you'll likely need. So maybe this is planning out what classes you'll use, or defining the API for your functions. Perhaps you'll draw some architectural diagrams, or just determine how your implementation, or how your solution to this feature will fit within the existing system. Maybe you'll decide, hey, I need a new library. You'll spend some time researching the different libraries that are available. And again, as with the requirement stage, if you're working on a regulated project, you'll probably need to document that, say in the software design specification. So next comes code construction, so the long green bar. The book Code Complete is all about this stage. It tends to be the longest, especially if you're using an agile methodology, and say requirements and design are kind of more iterative. And yeah. Next comes testing. Maybe you're writing unit tests, integration tests. Maybe if you're doing user interface development, there'll be ad hoc testing, and or perhaps you'll write some instructions for manual tests. Then there's code review, the topic of this topic, and then finally there's the integration stage, which I'm not really going to talk about too much, partly because on our projects, the integration stage tends to be relatively simple. Like, you'll merge it, you'll run the CI server, maybe you'll have a QA engineer run through tests once a week. But I do imagine on larger projects that gets more complicated. So, okay. So this model, like all models, approximates reality. As I'm sure you all know, it doesn't always go like this nice, neat sequence. So here, here I show a few scenarios that kind of are variations on this theme. So in practice, the distinctions between the stages are blurry. So maybe, you know, in this first case here, this is test-driven development. But you could kind of argue that, at least for myself, when I do test-driven development, writing the tests often guides the design. So it's sort of like writing out the test is part of design. So what's the clear distinction there? and even if you do write your tests at the end, often your design will just be merged in with construction. You'll kind of be thinking about it as you go because the design will sort of emerge as you get into the details, and maybe you'll try out a few things that won't work. So that's kind of this second scenario here. And then of course, sometimes requirements only emerge once you get into the code. So anyway, this is definitely an idealized model, but I'll be using it just because I think it's helpful. It's a good enough approximation for what we're doing, or for what we're thinking about today. And I also just wanted to shout out that I think you can use a lot more sophisticated models. There's this document that I think this is the Association for the Advancement of Medical Engineering or Medical. I'm not. I don't remember what the I stands for, but they published this document that maps a lot of the IAC 62304 standard requirements onto an agile process. And this is the model they use in that document, which I actually think is a pretty good model. But yeah, anyway. So, okay. So now that we've placed code review within the context of the development lifecycle, we can ask the big why question. So why do we do code reviews? So I think before the talk, I'd mentioned this in Slack to say, hey, spend some time thinking about like why do we do code reviews. So here's a few of the first answers that came to me. So one reason is, hey, we want to improve correctness. We want to catch bugs where we thought the code was doing one thing, the author thought that, but they missed something and it's actually doing something different. Even if the code does work, there's always this question of readability and maintainability, and this is a place where I think the reviewer is often at an advantage over the author because, as the author, you understand your function names because you wrote them, so you might not necessarily care if it's not obvious or if it's generic, whereas another person coming in will pretty quickly be able to identify that. Of course, you want to improve the design, so maybe you might say, hey, this works, maybe it's even readable, but the way it's organized will cause problems in the future that, so doing code reviews, hopefully you'll be able to find ways to improve the design. You'll identify, hey, maybe we need some more tests, maybe there's gaps in the testing. Then last I mentioned checking the requirements. Now, I'll talk about this more later. It's a little bit unique. I'm sure you probably noticed these bullets map back to some of the state life cycle stages, but I think requirements are a little unique. But so anyway, so we've got this list here, and I think I just asked everyone to think, like, is there something missing from this view? And so I think oh yeah, here we go. So I think there is. I think there's actually a big thing missing from that list, and that is that good code reviews, they're not really just about improving the specific code that you're reviewing, but they're also about improving the team and training the team. I guess that's probably clear in the title of the talk. But so I think good code reviews improve the team, but not only that, I would say improving the team is often in the long run the most efficient way to improve the code. So it's, I guess, yes. Here, 1 second. I've got some notes that I've been kind of following along on the side and it got messed up. Okay. So yeah, so why is this true that I would say it's kind of the same logic that justifies investing in your development environment. So it's those incremental improvements in productivity just start to pay for themselves quickly, and I think the same logic applies to the whole team. So, someone might say, hey, okay, I agree with that logic that if you improve yourself 1% each day, you'll become a 10x coder in, I don't know, a year or what. Like you'll get to be a lot better than you were before. But are code reviews the most efficient way to improve the team? Like, why not just say, hey, let's all read Code Complete or watch online lectures or whatever other approach you want. And I think this is a valid question, and I do think you should, and of course we do it as a company, do pursue both types of learning. But I think code reviews are special for a few reasons. First, they provide concrete situations to discuss and debate, whereas oftentimes coding books, I think, are limited by space or attention spans to relatively small snippets. So I think you can have maybe deeper discussions on things that are difficult to do outside of that. I also think if you're a more junior at some skill and you've got a senior reviewing you, they're giving you all the pointers that are specifically tailored for you. So whereas if you're reading something online, that's not always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. So furthermore, I think a lot of improvements and even team improvements are project specific, and so thus just less likely to be found in books or online. So in the least, code reviews help everyone else on the team become familiar with the code, so that in the future work on the code base for that project, you'll be able to move faster. But in addition to that, I think there's deeper kind of team level improvements that can occur. So for example, you might realize that you and the author of the code that you're reviewing have both been struggling with the same design problem. And then through this back and forth that happens in the pull request, you come to a solution that neither of you would have arrived at on your own. And in fact, Grace and I, on one of our projects, had a moment like this just a few weeks ago where we'd both been struggling with something with PyQt, and we kind of had this aha moment. We're like, oh yeah. And so I think I've experienced a lot of moments like that where it makes me really believe that code reviews are a great way to improve the team. Um, so, but I would say though, I don't think this is a silver bullet. It's partly because it's just a lot of work. So I'd say it's more like a lead bullet. um, and yeah, to be effective, yeah, it takes a lot of work, and I think you also need to have a good foundation. The team has to have shared values for learning and continued improvement and mutual respect just for everyone else, because this stuff can it can be kind of personal to have someone reviewing and making all these suggestions on something you've worked hard on. So okay, so maybe another way to say this is that we naturally focus our reviews on improving the code, but really we should balance improving the code, which is certainly still the goal, with also improving the team. And that goes both ways. Certainly the reviewer and the author can improve each other. So, so I think this principle has a number of implications, some of which we'll touch on in the second half of this talk. But I think the first one that's probably pretty clear is that doing in-depth code reviews are worth the time. I think that can be difficult because we have deadlines, we have clients asking us for things, and yeah, I mean the same way improving your dev environment can be difficult to make the time for that. I think making time for in-depth code reviews can be difficult, but I do think it's very worthwhile, and in the end results in better code, more efficient teams. Yeah. So, okay. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways or some of the reasons why I think these in-depth code reviews are worth it while. So, what I've often seen in the situation where you have a more junior person, let me take it back. When you have someone who's more junior with respect to a particular skill, so like not like I think it's easier and better to think about skill gaps in terms of like the particular skills instead of the whole person, because you can someone could be new to a language or new to a particular skill. So it's not like, hey, your title is junior engineer, thus you're just junior with everything. You might actually be senior in some skills. So also certainly this can be project specific as well. But anyway, so you've got this situation where there's a skill gap of some sort. And what I found is the review duration tends to be very longer than maybe you would naturally have, because you're focused so much on training and improving the team member. But over time, you quickly level out, and it never goes to zero because for various reasons. I mean, but it does drop considerably. And so this is maybe more the situation if you were less emphasizing growing the team and improving the team less than just focusing on the code. Maybe this would be more what it looks like. Um, and not only that, I think this diagram is probably ignoring the fact that as the author gets better and their skills improve, they'll also write the code faster too. Um, Another thing I kind of squeezed into this diagram here is you'll notice on the right there's one of these reviews is a little more in depth. So this is jumping the gun a bit, but one technique I found that's helpful once you get to the point where you do have two like rough equals on some skill or some code base, every once in a while diving in, doing a deep dive or like a philosophical deep dive into some small question can yield big results. So this has happened to me a number of times where it almost feels pedantic if you don't have this view, this belief that hey, these reviews help to improve the team, but it almost feels pedantic. But you dive in and you talk and talk, and then at some point you have this aha moment where you're both kind of taken to the next level. And Anyway, it's funny. I've been reading a lot of Plato lately, and in Plato, Socrates is really big on dialectic, like asking questions and going back and forth. And he actually believed, which I don't, I think, I don't believe, but he believed that there's these ideal forms that the only way you can really reach the ideal forms is through these like back and forth dialectic. But anyway, I think it's kind of a fun parallel. But um, anyway, so. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about how seniors can teach juniors, again, using these terms with regard to a particular skill, not as a person holistically. Um, so they can teach each other, equals can teach each other, but I think there's a couple other ways that code reviews can improve the team. So certainly, if you're a junior reviewing a more senior person's code, if your focus is just on, hey, like, how do we improve the code? That's the goal of this. Then you might almost think, hey, this is a less useful review because, like, I'm not, I don't know whatever this is. Like, and the senior person presumably does know. So you might feel like, hey, I can just do this kind of surface level review. But I would say feel confident that you can spend the time investing in like studying. Hey, what did they do? What do I understand? And trying to learn from it, so kind of turning it around more like that. And you never know. I mean, I'm often there's lots of just asking questions can reveal all sorts of interesting things that you might not expect. It's actually, well, I hope I don't go over time because I'm talking too much. But there's this story, and surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman, where I guess he was working on developing the nuclear bomb in World War II. And because he's a physicist, he got pulled in to consult on this. I think it was a uranium enrichment plant, if I remember. And the engineers are showing him these huge blueprints with all these pipes, and he really doesn't know what it means at all. But he just like points his finger at something and says, "Hey, what's this?" And it turned out to like reveal this like huge flaw in the design of the plant that I don't know. But then, and of course, they all thought he was a genius because of that. But he was a genius, but anyway, yeah, I don't know. So I think just asking questions and trying to study is a good thing. And then finally, I just mentioned, of course, when you teach something, you learn a lot about it. So it forces you to think about it and be able to conceptualize it and communicate it. So great. Okay. Moving on now to the second part of the talk. I initially said best practices, but then I just put practices because I don't really know if they're the best ones, but they're definitely practices. So all of in the first part, I was mostly talking about code review in a general sense. In this part, I'll be talking specifically about GitHub pull requests. So at Analytics, we usually use GitHub And so some of my comments will be tied to that, although I think Bitbucket and GitLab will work the same way. But I'd also mention there's other ways to do code reviews. I mean, you can email a diff, a code diff, or you can do an over-the-shoulder review, which can certainly be effective. So, but okay, so we can, it's kind of to organize my suggestions. I followed this. I kind of broke down the review process using a pull request a little more. So first we got, the author creates the pull request, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we've got the reviewer at some point, maybe a little later, will review the code, write suggestions. Then of course there'll be some responses back and forth, and then you finally merge it. I guess merge should probably be in the integration step, but oh well. So let's start with some practices for creating pull requests. So, okay, when should you create a pull request? So I think most of the time we when we're done with code construction, testing, then hey, we create the pull request. But sometimes it can be nice if you're having doubts about your approach, or you just want someone to take a quick glance and get a second opinion, to do a review. Maybe you'll do a draft review, I don't know, in the middle of construction. So actually, you, John, and I do this quite a bit, or I certainly send you, John, these from time to time. Another approach is to do design stage reviews. And I think these are especially useful if you're a more junior engineer. Again, junior with respect to whatever skill. I think, it's always unfortunate when there's design issues that are caught after you've constructed everything, because it tends to be a significant amount of waste. So, if you're nervous, I think you should definitely feel comfortable asking for a review early on, because it can usually be pretty quick. And so maybe this would be like, here are stubs for the functions and classes I'm thinking about, or maybe here's a diagram, like just whatever you've got, and just say, hey, I want a quick review. Another comment I'd make about design stage reviews is, if you're the project lead, or even if you're an engineer on the project and you suspect a feature has some landmines, some design landmines, or maybe you've even thought about the design somewhat yourself already, because maybe you were scheduled to do it, but then things priorities shifted. I think it's appropriate and useful to request that you get a design stage review. Say, hey, like, write out your design, then come to me and show it to me. And I've used this strategy quite effectively a number of times. So, okay, so this is kind of a related question, but like, how big should your PRs be? I think we talked about this quite a bit 3 weeks ago, when we talked about the article that Casey had proposed. But I guess a few comments. So smaller pull requests are easier to review. It's easier to fit into your schedule, but it's definitely possible for PRs to be too small. If someone sent me a review every day of the week, all on a related issue, when it could have all very easily been lumped into one on Friday, like, I would certainly prefer the one on Friday, because it reduces the interruption. So you can err both ways, although in practice I think it's much more common for the error to be, hey, I've been working on this for 3 months, and here's this huge review that's now going to take you a week to review or more, which is not optimal. But when you do run into the situation where you have a large pull request, one thing you can do to make the reviewer's job easier is to kind of squash down some dead end commits, and try and set it up such that they can review commit by commit, and each commit is sort of like a mini PR as you go. I haven't actually used this approach that was in the article, and I think maybe Reese had said he was going to give this a shot, but anyway, it sounds like a good idea to me in that situation. Okay, so we've talked about when you should create a PR. Now, who should you assign the PR to? It's not often an issue for us because our teams are so small, but I would say certainly it depends on the risk. Like if something is high risk, you might want a more senior person to look at it. But on the flip side, thinking again in terms of improving the team through the code reviews, you can also consider, hey, who's going to learn the most from reviewing this? Um, and those two are, I guess, in tension. But another thing to consider is having multiple reviews or multiple reviewers. Uh, I've actually never used that approach, but I don't know. It might be worth exploring. Another question is, what should you put in the opening comment? Um, so here, this is just what it looks like in GitHub. So what do you insert here? So one thing I would say is, if there's information that will be useful after the merge, then I tend to think you probably want to put it somewhere else, either in comments or in design documentation. So if you're describing like why questions like, oh, I considered a few other designs and this ended up being the one that worked, that information is often useful in the future. And I think we can't always go back and look at the pull requests and certainly do that, but I think it's more tightly tied to the code when it's in the Git repository. It tends to be easier to search for with tools, and we've even had a few cases where we've migrated Git hosts, or we've merged a few different repositories, and sometimes I imagine there's ways to migrate the data, but sometimes it's just not worth it. So you lose the Git history because of that. So anyway, I tend to think the information that you want to go in this comment should be focused on what is kind of ephemerally useful to do the review, and then anything else can just be pointers. So like, hey, go make sure you read my update of the design doc or whatever. Um, uh, so some things that fall in that category, you might want to tell the reviewer, hey, focus on this part because I'm especially nervous about the design here. So definitely, if you're going to look at one thing carefully, look at that. Or you might say, hey, look at this file first because this will help the other stuff make sense. You might mention if you did write good commit messages or expected them to go commit by commit, you probably want to mention that too. And if there's UI changes, then you might want to include screenshots just to be considerate so that the person doesn't have to pull up the code and get to the situation where they can review whatever features you're editing. So I mean, that certainly none of these things are hard and fast rules. Like maybe the other person, it would be trivial for them to just look at it and you don't want to bother with screenshots, but anyway, often that's nice. Okay, so then now at this point you've created the pull request. You know, hey, I need a pull request. Here's who I'm assigning it to. Here's the commit message I wrote. But now, and maybe you're waiting for the person to start reviewing it, and you say, hey, I noticed a bug, or maybe I had some new comments. Is it, or comments you want to include? Is it okay to push these up? So I would say generally yes. I think it's okay to do that because really, especially if it's a bug, you're going to just save the reviewer's time if they go and review that and it's not really relevant. Or if maybe they haven't gotten started and you just want to squeeze another few commits in, sure. But I think if the reviewer's already started reviewing and the changes can go in the next pull request, then you probably don't want to push them up because it just I mean, you can split it out in GitHub, but it just kind of confuses things. So I would avoid that. Okay, so moving on to the review stage. This is probably the one that I have the most comments about. Okay, so this is probably a sensitive question, but when should you review? So usually, usually we're working on code, and then out of nowhere you get this ping in your email or Slack saying, "Hey, you were assigned a pull request," and you're like deep in the middle of something, and you've got a lot of things on your plate. So, when should what are your responsibilities here, I guess. So the first thing I would just mention is don't begin reviewing until you're actually assigned. So sometimes people will create pull requests and not assign you, and so at least the convention I always follow is until you're assigned, maybe the person's still working on it. You can also create draft pull requests. So maybe people use that more now, but don't assume that the review is ready just because there is a pull request. Um, so okay, so but that aside, so when should you review? I would say usually as soon as you can. I mean, and this might be kind of a contentious thing. I'd like to talk about it after the talk, um, but I think there's several advantages to doing it. So often I think the cost of the interruption is higher, or the cost of the delay is higher for the author than it is for the reviewer, I think. And I might be wrong about this, but I think so. If you're the author, you've got all this code in your head, and um, you're going to have to switch and start another task if you don't have the review. So if it takes a few days, you might now be halfway through some other thing. Um, so yeah. Anyway, I think there's a lot of advantages for trying to prioritize the reviews higher than whatever other thing you're working on. Um, but that said, oh yeah, and I'd also mention, you can do quick reviews too. Like if you know you're busy, you say, hey, I'm going to take a quick glance, and maybe especially if there's a big skill gap between the reviewer and the author, you might say, oh, here's a few quick comments that I know will just keep you busy and then I'll plan on finishing the review later. That can be pretty effective, but but again, I don't think this is a hard and fast rule. I think probably the principle underlying it is where's the biggest cost. So is it more costly to interrupt you, or is it more costly to interrupt the author? And that should be what guides how you prioritize this. So if there's deadlines or other issues, then certainly that will dictate this. And in fact, I actually have two pull requests. I think one for Grace and Matt that I delayed. I was like, hey, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to get this until tomorrow or Thursday, because I've got to focus on this talk because I didn't want to push it back again. um, so anyway, yeah. Hopefully we can talk about this after. So next question: batch versus individual comments. Um, the way I think about this is if you know that you just got the email, you just were assigned to the pull request, and you're going to start reviewing this immediately. In that case, I use the single comment, and the reason for that is because it allows the author to begin reading and responding while I'm finishing my review. So there's a little risk that maybe one of your early comments will become irrelevant as you understand things better. But I think that's relatively uncommon compared to the savings of like being able to kind of parallelize and avoid the back and forth cost. So on the flip side, if you've waited, it's been a day, and then you're doing it, then I would not use the individual comment. I would do a review, because in that case, the other person's probably moved on to something else. And if you start sending the one comments, this is what happens to me anyways. I'll start looking at them, and then I'll kind of it'll slow me down because I'll look at the first one, and then I'll kind of be waiting as they come in slowly. Whereas if they just all come in at once, it's much more efficient. So anyway, that's how I think about it, and you reduce the risk of having those irrelevant comments if you realize, oh, actually they addressed this elsewhere or whatever. So yeah, okay. How long should you spend? So we talked a little bit about this already. I do think probably longer than we are in general. Like I think people, in my experience, the general natural thing is to spend less time on reviews than you should, and hopefully my arguments about why it's important to improve the team will, I don't know, push in the other direction. But I think there's a few other factors that definitely affect how long the review should be. So the skill gap is a big one. Like how much of a training opportunity is there here? How new is someone? Oh, I guess not how new is someone on the project. How new is the product in general? Like, are we learning new technologies where, with having us review, we're more likely to have one of these aha moments like Grace and I did, that really shapes the project, and that I think happens more early on in projects than later. Certainly depends on the risk, like how risky is something. It's like it's with regards to patient health, or business risk too. Like how bad is it if there is a bug? Well, then let's spend a lot of time trying to prevent that. Um, and then certainly, we're all busy, so you got to balance that with all the other things you're doing, and try and prioritize it appropriately. But okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to review different stages, different outputs from the feature lifecycle. So, um, okay, reviewing requirements. So something that makes reviewing requirements difficult is, unlike in the case of the code where you generally do have all the code in front of you and you have the full context, when it comes to requirements, you don't have you're not really in the best position as the reviewer to review that because you're not the product owner. So really one of the reasons we do agile and we have sprint planning meetings with the product owner on the meeting is so that they can at least once a week be reviewing the requirements and saying you guys are going in the right direction, or like this is what I like or don't like. And that's we often have demos at the beginning of our sprint planning meetings, and that's often the purpose of those demos is to act as that review. That said, there certainly are still some things as a reviewer you can do. So you're probably sitting in on the sprint planning meeting, so you might just happen to have some context that the author might have missed. You can also, I guess, at least check that the stated requirements, say in the GitHub issue or in the requirements documentation, were all met. Like just make sure, hey, you did everything that we said. You can also, I've seen this happens more, I think, with more junior engineers, but like just checking that there's no gold plating going on, where you say like adding in things that weren't actually part of the requirements, or just making sure, like kind of reviewing the requirements gathering process itself versus the requirements. Just making sure, did you ask about this? That sort of thing. So I think there's still some utility in reviewing the requirements. And then you can of course review that, hey, we actually documented the requirements when that's necessary. I'll link to, this is a pretty good article on gold plating. Okay, so how to review design. So I think reviewing design is difficult because a lot of the times, the natural thing to do is just start looking at the code diff, and it's easier to see what is there versus what is not there, because what's not there is just not in the diff. And I think especially at the design phase, being cognizant of like, hey, the problems may be the things that aren't there, more so than what is there, is tricky. So one technique that I like to use and I found to be pretty effective is I'll won't look at the diff. I'll start by reading the requirements. I'll then sketch out in my mind how I would solve the problem. Then look at the code and kind of see how it's different. And I think this encourages you to kind of think about what's not there, and it kind of makes it more fun too, to figure out. So, and another common thing is to just think of risks, or sequences of events that can lead to hazardous situations. Say like, hey, did we check that, I don't know, the disk is full, or things like that. And again, as with requirements, check for documentation. So, okay, so moving on to reviewing construction. I think this is the easiest thing to review generally, and it's definitely important. But I think a tendency I've seen is that it's easier to focus on the construction versus the design. So I would say, like, when in doubt, focus more on the design, but certainly don't be afraid to be detail oriented too. I think software development is a very detail oriented field, and I think there can be like a fear again of, hey, I don't want to like spend valuable time talking about like small issues like white space or should I split this function out or naming. Um, and again, there's lots of balances, but I do think keeping in mind that the goal of improving the team, that keeping that in mind, that focusing on these details can really matter a lot, especially if there's a skill gap. Now, if there's not a skill gap like we talked about before, I think doing selective, really in-depth discussions can be fun and helpful to do. Um, yeah, and I'll talk about this more at the end, but there's also the factor of like billing clients and where's the line between what we feel comfortable billing clients for a time versus not. And I think anyway, we'll talk about that more later, but I think that these in-depth discussions is a place where I generally don't want to bill for that. um, okay, and again, being mindful, being mindful of what's missing at the design level is one thing, but then also at the construction level. So like if you change a CSS class, you can silently break things, or if you rename, if you rename a string, like maybe, I don't know, just checking like, hey, are we sure this is all the cases? Maybe even grepping yourself a bit can help you see things that are missing versus just what's in the diff. Um, okay, I don't have a whole lot to say about reviewing tests, although I do think again should be risk driven. I think especially with junior engineers focusing on just hey like writing tests is a big thing, and I also think code quality does matter in tests. Yeah. So this is a lot of things to think about, and something that I found to be pretty useful that we use on a few of our regulated projects is to have a checklist. And GitHub actually has a nice feature for creating these templates. That the way I use these is like each of these lines here. I would write a comment in when I'm doing a review, say requirements look good. Sometimes something's not applicable, and you just write NA. Actually, a lot of times one of them won't be applicable, and I think it's beneficial to even customize these for each project. So like if there's certain things you want to really be sure you don't miss, having a checklist for that's project specific can be a nice thing too. Um, yeah, this is a lot. So I wanted to make a few comments of like when you're feeling overwhelmed because you just got this big pull request. I think the number one suggestion I have here is to get on a call with the author and talk through the pull request. That can save a lot of time in my experience. A few other little things. I like to use the little viewed feature to kind of, especially if it's a big pull request, to kind of mark what I've looked at already. It kind of minimizes like the getting lost and the up and down going through the code. And then of course going commit by commit can be good. Yes. So moving on. So now you've reviewed the code, and probably you'll be writing comments as you go. But I want to make a few comments about actually giving feedback and writing the comments in the pull request. So the first thing is to ask questions. I think this is up there with one of the three kind of key points in this talk. Is I think unless you're really confident about that something could be improved, or about some suggestion you want to make, you want to start with questions and ask things like, hey, why did you use this approach versus this other approach? Or like, why do you think this is a good name for this function? Or things like that. I've been amazed at how often I'm pretty confident. I'm like, hey, I don't think this is the best way to do this. And I'm like tempted to just say, hey, I think we should change this to X. But then I ask a question, and it turns out there's actually a really good reason that I hadn't thought about. And asking questions is a good way to avoid that. And I think it's like nicer. It's more intellectually humble, and you don't look like a jerk if it turns out like actually, yeah, you're wrong, and you just suggested something out of nowhere. But another thing is complimenting good code. So I think this is really important, and I think it goes back to the distinction between focusing on the specific code versus focusing on improving the team. So I think if you're focused on the code, you might say, well, hey, just saying, hey, this is great. This is an elegant way to solve this problem. Comments like that are kind of just a distraction. But if you look at the whole team, like I think you were very, I'm motivated by the respect of my coworkers and what people think about me, and kind of just recognizing like, hey, yeah, you did a really good job here. This looks great. That I don't know. It kind of keeps everyone invested in saying, hey, like we believe what we're doing is good and we respect each other. So I think writing compliments is a good thing. But the flip side, if you actually don't think some code is good, don't like feel like you've got to write good comments just because I think that actually defeats the whole purpose of it. In that, like, you don't want to give phony feedback either. But okay, if there's a skill gap, yeah. Oh, so this is kind of the opposite point. So if you are very confident and you really do know like this is just not the right way to do it, don't. It's not like you always have to ask questions. It could actually almost get to be insulting if you're asking a question for something that's just really there's no other explanation. So I'm more, there's a spectrum here. I'm just arguing that you should ask questions till pretty far along the spectrum of confidence. Um, Also, again, if there's a skill gap, if you're like maybe training someone who's new on the project or someone who's new to a language, suggesting background reading and pointing to links, maybe even a 10x lesson, those are certainly it's worth the time um, to look up. Again, thinking about the whole team. Um, I'd also I took this term negative results from like academia, but if you do an experiment and you get a negative result, should you publish that? But in the case of code reviews, I would say if you were worried about something, you thought something was a bad idea, you looked into it, it turned out it was a good idea. I actually communicate that as well. I think it's helpful for the reviewer to know, one, that you just spent the effort looking into it. But so I guess that's another comment that might seem like it's useless if we're just focused on just the specific code. But and the last comment I would make is, sometimes you like know something is the right way to do it, but you also know that you don't do it yourself that well. So like maybe it's writing stand-ups or whatever it is, like writing tests. This is a hard one, but I don't think it's appropriate to like lower your standards in the review just because you don't follow your own advice. I think maybe when you run into that and you say, hey, I don't actually write tests that often and I feel like I should, maybe it's like either you should really be writing tests or you should ask yourself, well, why? Maybe there's some trade-off and maybe you have this kind of guilt that you feel like you should be doing it, but there's actually good reasons why you don't because other things are actually more important. And having that conversation can clarify that. So anyway, yeah. Uh, okay, so gosh, I know this is getting to be a lot here, but we're getting pretty close. Okay, now you've left a bunch of comments, and now there's kind of this last comment, and this is a screenshot from what it looks like within GitHub. So what should you include? What should you include here? So we've got three options: comment, approve, request changes, or request changes. I basically follow what they say here. So if there are important changes, I'll say request changes. If I'm just, maybe I'm only halfway through the review, then I might say comment like, hey, I'm still got a ways to go, but here's a set of things to look at. There's approve, and then there's actually a fourth one that I use a lot, which is what I call like a pre-approve, where I'll leave a few comments that I do think should be addressed, but I'll say, hey, I'm confident you'll be able to address them. There's no need to come back to me with another review. So like, feel free to merge once you've addressed these issues, and then I'll mark it as approved. Again, I'd be curious how other people do this, but that's how I do it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now going back to the author responding to the reviewer. So here's a quote from Plato's Republic. So Socrates is talking with his friends about justice, and there's this bystander Thrasymachus, who I think was a sophist, and he jumps in and he's upset with Socrates and he berates him a bit. And so this is what Socrates says. He says, "Hey, Thrasymachus, don't be hard on us if we are making any mistake in the consideration of the arguments. Know well that we're making an unwilling mistake. If we were searching for gold, we would never willingly make way for one another in the search and ruin our chances of finding it." So I like this quote, and I bring it in here for a few reasons. I think, um, I guess it can be pretty personal, like listening to someone make suggestions. But I think keeping in mind that we're all searching for the same thing, and that this shared value of like we want to as a team become better developers and write better software for our clients and ultimately patients. That's the motivation. And when we do have these, you also don't want to like give in if we do have this pushback, this back and forth. That's what you're searching for. You're saying, hey, it's not about you or winning the argument. Like I want to figure out what is the best way to write safe code. Um, so, and anyway, so okay, so here are a few thoughts. Uh, if if you disagree with the suggestion, don't, especially if this is probably hard, but like if it's like me or you, John, making it, definitely push back. Like make your case, and have the back and forth. There's another thing where you might agree that hey, this what you suggested is better, but there's really just not, like we've got a deadline. Like I don't have time to mess with this. Again, you can make your case on that. Um, so those are a few comments, and this is important. I think if we're spending all the effort doing these reviews, I think it's important to respond to everything, um, out of respect for the reviewer. And so that means like if you disagree with something, don't respond to it, or like just merge and just ignore it. I think that's unhealthy and kind of decreases the motivation to do the reviews. Um, and often just a thumbs up is sufficient. Um, Another thing, I think this is kind of a general thing, but like if you do make a mistake, like let's say you didn't know about set comprehensions and someone says, "Oh, like hey, maybe you can use a set comprehension here." There's sometimes this like this motivation to say, "Hey, oh yeah, I didn't know about set comprehensions," or I mean, not that that's bad per se, but like I guess you don't need to feel the pressure to always justify like what you're doing. I think that um, it kind of creates a cycle of like defensiveness that I don't know. This might be a contentious thing, but I'd be curious to hear what people think. But I think avoiding those sorts of justifications is usually a good thing. Um, and then yeah, once you're done reviewing, I think letting the reviewer know, hey, like I'm done. Can you review again? Just request another review in GitHub. So okay. Next. Okay, so again, the back and forth, be gracious. Like that. This is it can be a little personal. And then once you start with questions, and you might have a few rounds of questions, but once you do understand the situation, really then that's when you make suggestions and you say, hey, like maybe use a PyTest fixture for this, or maybe this can be split out into a decorator since it's being repeated over and over, or whatever it is. And then yeah, once you're done with the second review, be sure to approve it, or like we talked about earlier. Then finally merging. Few small comments. So the author should be the person to handle the merge in most cases. Every once in a while, you might say, "Hey, I'm going to be out of town," or like, or maybe someone has a PR and it's just urgent, and you just have to merge their PR for some reason. That stuff happens. But in general, the author should do the merge. And I think as the author, you want to avoid like sneaking in new code. Um, Again, it's not hard and fast, but usually that's not good, especially on the regulated projects. I don't think you should do that. Um, and then, and if you have one of those pre-approved merges, just be sure that hey, I really did check all the comments, and then finally delete the branch. So great. I thought I'd end with some of our company values that I think touch on code reviews. So these are all taken from our list of values. So we complement each other when we write good code. We help each other learn new things. We don't just hack our way through problems. We aren't satisfied knowing that it works. We want to know why it works, and we view each system logically without superstition. So great. So in conclusion here, kind of three main points. So one, I think you want to review the outputs of all the life cycle stages. Don't just focus on construction, even though that's naturally the easiest one to focus on. Two, good code reviews should balance improving the team with improving the code. They're both important, but yeah, focus on improving the team, and that in turn justifies the more in-depth code reviews. And then three, you ask a lot of questions, like avoid suggestions until you're really confident it's a good suggestion and you're not missing some context. So